Hey there, Eli coming at you again from the coral rooms of Coventry, here today with another episode of Ecology with Eli. Today I was hoping to talk a little bit about reef building organisms, what makes the reef environment so special, and some of the ways that we can apply some of that knowledge back into our own reef aquariums. So first and foremost, what is the reef? A lot of us that keep saltwater aquariums think we have a decent understanding of what the reef is and what it consists of, but a lot of times our home aquariums are not necessarily going to resemble the reef in every manner in which the wild really does. So reefs in the wild consist of everything from the animals that live within them, be them snails, sponges, fish, corals, invertebrates, vertebrate animals, but it also includes the structure upon which the reef is built. And generally, the reef structure is actually built by what we call reef building organisms. In most of our reef tanks, the reef building organisms consist almost entirely of stony corals. However, years and years and decades of development and growth on wild reefs allows for all of these sessile invertebrates, sessile meaning that they stay put in one place, whether they be corals, whether they be tube worms, whether they be clams and the like, any of these organisms that settle onto the substrate, settle onto the rock, or onto other organisms, and they build out this skeleton, and that is actually what gives the reef its structure. So on a really well-established reef in the wild, almost all of the stone that is laid behind is actually built by once living organisms. So most of the stone, most of the actual reef structure in the wild is calcium carbonate and aragonite based. And this is from the animals that, like I just mentioned earlier, any animal that's making a shell or making a stony skeleton behind it, as that animal grows, as it dies, and as it gives room for the next organism to take its place, it is laying down these piles of rock behind it. In this tank behind me here, I actually have a lot of really long-term captive corals. Some of these came from tanks that were just taken down, and some of these are on really old pieces of live rock, which is just a really interesting thing to be able to see. Some of these pieces of rock have really interesting structure to them, to where you can absolutely, certainly guarantee that these were real pieces of live rock from a wild reef in the past. Now, in recent years, live rock is not able to be harvested from a lot of reefs. There are some maricultured options out there, some rock that is basically man-made or dry rock that is seeded out on wild reefs for a while. There's a lot of this happening down in Florida. And then once this rock has stayed out there for a long enough time, and with the proper permitting, this is basically farmed or maricultured live rock that can then be brought back in for sale for aquariums. But some of this rock behind me here is definitely older, predates some of this legislature that makes that illegal. And some of this rock is most certainly actual live rock from the Pacific Ocean, which is just really cool to see. So a lot of the rocks that we use in our aquariums these days oftentimes is actually synthetic. Most of the saltwater aquariums that we set up here at OSA are set up with cornerstone dry rock, which is a man-made manufactured rock. It is perfectly safe. It is very appropriate to use in the saltwater aquarium setting. However, it does not have any of these fouling organisms present. For the sake of keeping a sterile aquarium, this is a really great option, considering that it does not have any of your pest animals, whether those be flatworms or they be sessile invertebrates like tube worms, verminid snails, and some of these other ugly critters that we don't want to hit our tanks. Starting with dry rock is a very good option, but for the tried and true aquarist, for the die-hard old school aquarist, real live rock is always where it's at, and it offers so much diversity of life to add to your aquarium. Now, in the wild, what are some of the benefits of these reef building organisms and these organisms that actually build real stone structure in the wild? By organisms building shells, building rock, building stony skeletons, they actually provide a 3D structure on the reef. This helps any of the other organisms that wish to live within the reef. It offers some structure, area to hide from predation, and just structure for things like clams and other sessile invertebrates to attach themselves to. In addition, any of your shoreline communities that are built around coral reefs are offered really major benefits just by being in close proximity to a reef. As funny as it sounds, a lot of your reefs, especially shallow reefs near shore, they are most responsible for dampening any of the wave action that comes off of the open oceans. So as large movements of waves are coming in, approaching shore, the shallow reefs that are close enough to the surface of the water are actually absorbing most of the impact from that wave action and making sure that the water movement as it approaches the shore is slowing down. This offers a huge benefit to any of your shoreline communities, any beaches, any other shoreline structures, whether that be man-made structures or other environmental ecosystems that would happen on the shore. And the reefs are honestly majorly important in preventing large amounts of erosion and other sort of wave or storm damage that would occur routinely in some of these tropical areas. So a lot of your tropical beaches, a lot of the shoreline communities in those areas are actually offered an immense amount of protection by reef building animals. And for that reason, it is very important to make sure that we are maintaining the best health of our wild reefs as possible. On that note, morphology of a lot of your corals is going to differ based on where they come from, and it's kind of interesting. There are some patterns to look for that make it very abundantly clear as to what areas of reefs that animals most likely come from. If you take into effect some of your branching corals, I have right here a beautiful bird's nest coral. This animal here is most definitely a very dense branching growth form of a coral, and it is very small polyps with a bunch of skeleton beneath it. One of the benefits of this coral, and one of the things that you can assume that this coral is participating in, is this coral is actually basically developed to handle a bunch of flow, a bunch of light, and to live toward the surface of the waters. For the most part, any of the branching style stony corals that you run across, especially really delicate or fine branching corals, are going to come from very shallow waters in the wild. And that is because just that shape that that coral possesses allows it to be set up to handle that flow, to handle the amount of light, and that is where those corals thrive. So keeping that in mind when you're setting up a tank, especially if you want an SPS dominant tank, offering a lot of light, offering a lot of flow, very important way to make sure that these stony corals are happy in the environment that you place them in. Now, contrastingly, if we pull in the idea of LPS, or large polyp stony corals, I've got a handful of different hammer colonies, frog spawn colonies here, and a beautiful lobo behind me as well. These corals, as much as they can handle a decent amount of flow, they are built with much larger polyps. A lot of these polyps are 1.5 inches, 2 inches across in diameter when fully opened, which is a very stark difference to the polyp size of that bird's nest coral behind me. These organisms do appreciate a decent amount of flow just to make sure that there is always fresh water being pushed past them, always an influx of cool water going past them, and it offers them the ability to catch a lot of food particles as water moves past them. However, placing this coral in the same environment as you would place a branching stony coral, like that bird's nest or Pocillopora or Acropora colony, is not the most appropriate. They really don't want to be part of that reef crest, part of the top of the reef, because they are not shaped appropriately to handle that much light. Too much light for those polyps would lead to bleaching and lead to other issues, and they're really not set up for that amount of flow. These large fleshy polyps are really prone to damage if they are placed in too much flow. And additionally, if you were to look at some of your other animals like corallomorphs, which are mushroom corals, anemones, and some of these other animals, especially things that are really fleshy and really built tight and compact to the bottom, these animals also really don't want a ton of flow. They are setting themselves up in really low light areas, setting themselves up in lower flow areas, and areas to where they can just open up, absorb all the sunlight they need for photosynthesis, and allow things to settle upon them, such as small planktons that they can then eat from in the wild. So again, keeping all those things in mind, keeping morphology of corals in mind, their shape, their structure, and where they really want to be on the reef is really important to ensuring your long-term success in setting up these corals. Especially when you're looking at stony or reef-building organisms, keeping those options in mind is important to your success in the long run in keeping a reef aquarium. With all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed hearing me babble a little bit about reef-building organisms. I hope that considering some of these different aspects of stony corals and other sessile invertebrates and the idea of a reef being built around live structures is an interesting concept for you, and I hope that I was able to kind of propose some of these ideas that make it a little more easy for you to be successful with keeping corals alive in your aquarium. It's definitely important to keep some of these options in mind, some of these concepts in mind when you're considering different types of corals and how to care for them in your reef aquarium at home. As always, thank you guys for tuning in. Please feel free, if you have questions, comments, suggestions, leave them in the comments section below. And as always, keep on reefing.